Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I just want to reiterate Ernst's point that this was a team effort. And if you look inside there's a list of the people, the co-authors, and all the people who engaged in this effort. And it was really an exploration by a large group of people about what is it, how do we account for, you might say, the weaknesses in the European economy. Let me begin, and what can be done about it. Let me begin by saying a word about the original book, this book called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, an Agenda for Growth and Shared Prosperity. That was a book done by the Roosevelt Institute. The Roosevelt Institute is a think tank associated with the Presidential Library of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, and dedicated to the preservation and extension of the values that FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt stood for. And so it is the progressive think tank in the United States. We about 5 years ago reflected on the fact that what was happening in the United States was very different from what we thought the direction of the economy, our society should be going. Growth was not that great, and what growth there was going overwhelmingly to the very top. When I say that, you really have to understand that wages at the bottom in the United States are the same level that they were 60 years ago. So for those at the bottom, there's been no increase for more than a half a century. And average income of the bottom 90%, we're not talking about the bottom here, the bottom 90% have essentially stagnated for more than a quarter century. Meanwhile, all the proceeds have gone to the very top. So the question is, how did that happen? In a society where we talk about equality, we talk 40 years ago, President Reagan talked about a set of reforms that were supposed to lead to faster economic growth, and through a mysterious process called trickle-down economics, everybody would benefit. And there were a whole set of reforms, I put that in quotation marks, reforms that were globalization, financialization, and advances in technology, all of which were supposed to make us a better performing economy. And we prided ourselves about knowing how to manage the economy better. We were so much smarter. And what happened after all these reforms and with all that knowledge? Our economy grew more slowly than it did in the decades after World War II. And as I just mentioned, the proceeds of that growth all went to a very few people at the top. Inequality grew and the stagnation was pervasive, and a lot of people saw their incomes go down. It was also clear to many of us at the time that if we didn't do something about this, there would be political consequences. And unfortunately, those predictions turned out to be right. There have been political consequences that have been, to say the least, unfortunate. So, what was our diagnosis? Our diagnosis was actually that the set of ideas that underlay the reforms at that period, beginning in the 1980s, ideas that in the United States we called supply-side economics, and in Europe you called neoliberalism, and really the same set of ideas, were really to blame. That is to say, those ideas had helped shape policies. And we took actually a very detailed view, and we came to the perspective that what had happened beginning in around 1980 was that the rules of the economy, broadly understood, had changed in ways that led to lower economic growth and more inequality. So when I say the rules of the game broadly understood, what I mean is basically everything that determines the way the economy functions, from the legal framework like corporate governance, bankruptcy law, labor legislation, competition law, and the way our institutions function, like the rules governing the Federal Reserve Board, inflation targeting, focusing on. So these are what constitute what we mean the rules of the economy. So the perspective that we came to and that we detailed in the book were that in the period beginning around 1980, the basic underlying institutional framework, the rules of the economy, have been rewritten, and what we were experiencing were the consequences of that rewriting of the rules. If that is the right diagnosis, then the prognosis is that if we don't change things, things will continue bad. And the prescription followed also. We had to rewrite the rules once again. Not to go back to what they were in 1975 or 1970 or 1980, but to rewrite the rules for the 21st century. It's a different economy, technology changed, the world's changed, and that meant we faced a big challenge. We should have been rewriting the rules continuously, reflecting the changes in our economy. But we rewrote the rules in the wrong way, and now our challenge of rewriting the rules is even greater because we have to rewrite them, I would say, in the right way. So the book was an attempt to detail both the ways they have been rewritten in the wrong way, the particular intellectual ideas that underlie those, it's not only the neoliberal ideology written broadly, but things like, to give you just one example, the idea that firms should only pay attention to shareholder value. Maximizing shareholder value became the centerpiece of the obligation of firms. As opposed to, in Europe, many legal frameworks were that you should have stakeholder value. You should look at workers, the community in which the firms operate. It's part of the legal framework, and it had been part of the legal framework in the United States. And Milton Friedman, who led in the disastrous development of monetarism in macro, was also responsible for the reforms in microeconomics that led to shareholder value maximization, which has had such a disastrous effect on corporate governance around the world. So this gives you a broad perspective of where we had begun in our work. But it was very clear that the perspectives that had dominated on that side of the Atlantic were similar to those that dominated on this side of the Atlantic. And in some ways, things were worse on this side of the Atlantic because these ideas were transcendent, were very strong, just at the time that the euro was being created, just at the time the Maastricht Treaty was being signed, that it was the moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where a lot of people thought capitalism had triumphed. The reality was that communism was a flawed economic system that was doomed to failure. And so it wasn't our achievement, it was their failure. But people like Fukuyama would write about the end of history, that we would all converge to liberal, market-oriented democracies. Well, even Fukuyama now says that was wrong. That we are at a moment in history where confidence in our market democracy, our market economy and our democracies is being questioned around the world. And one of the reasons it's being questioned is because our economies have not been serving a majority of our citizens. And it just reminds us the imperative to make our economy serve our society. Now let me say, I believe unambiguously that the market economy can do this, that it is not inevitable that a market economy be characterized by the kind of inequality that we've seen. And that to do that, to get an economy, a market economy that serves society, we have to rewrite those rules. And markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured. They are structured by a political process. And that's why politics is so important. And really, the call of the book is to say, let's go ahead on this agenda of restructuring the rules of the market economy, a political process. And here are some guidelines of how to think about it. It's the beginning of a conversation. It's the beginning of a dialogue of how to restructure the rules of the European economy in ways to make it more likely that it will serve the citizens of all of the European Union. So let me just talk a little bit more about the details of this book. Naturally, we begin, and this is different from where the American book, it's natural to begin by macroeconomics. Europe had just gone through episodes of austerity, the European crisis, and a response to the European crisis that clearly, from the perspective of large portions of Europe, were not a success. The fact was that large parts went into deep recession. Depression is the only word. A depression that was actually greater than the Great Depression in several of the European countries. And it was a depression caused by the policies and the institutions, the rules of Europe. The rules were supposed to make the European Union work better, and particularly the rules were supposed to make the Eurozone work better. They were called the convergence criteria. And the idea behind that was actually related to work my colleague at Columbia, Bob Mundell, put forward, that for a single currency to work, you had taken away two of the important mechanisms of adjustment, interest rates and exchange rate. It would only work if countries were similar enough. And so they had to converge. And they wrote a set of rules that they thought would help facilitate that. And that was to be enforced by the Growth and Stability Pact. The numbers were 2% inflation, 3% deficit, 60% debt. I want you to understand those rules were pulled out of thin air. Those numbers had no research behind them. They were just numbers. You needed a number, so they said, well, 2% sounds good. And a lot of economic research said, no, 2% is not a good. But it became a convention. And if you disagreed with that convention, you were viewed as odd. But those particular conventions did not serve Europe well. They particularly exacerbated the problems confronting Europe as a result. When you created the Eurozone, you took away the interest rate and exchange rate mechanism, and then the growth and stability said you also can't use fiscal policy. So monetary policy wouldn't work, fiscal policy, exchange rate policy didn't work. The result of that was you got deeper economic downturns. Europe had focused in a way on old problems rather than the problems of the future. And they had focused on, it was right that they focused on externalities, but they focused on the wrong externalities. What do I mean by that? So they focused on inflation. Inflation had been a problem in the past. But what was the problem going forward? Unemployment, and especially youth unemployment, that would destroy the potential growth going forward. So they should have had, rather than a growth and stability pact, they should have had a growth employment and stability pact. They should have recognized the importance of jobs. And if they had had that, they would have had different results. They worried that if one country had excessive debt and deficit, it would lead to inflation in other countries. No evidence that that had ever been a significant problem, but particularly that was turned out not to be the most important externality, where cross-border actions in one country affected those in other countries. Insufficient demand in one country can lead to insufficient growth and demand in other countries. That was the cross-border externality that Keynes had worried about and had hoped Bretton Woods would address, but it didn't. There was another important externality that has turned out to be important, which is beggar-thy-neighbor policies through tax. They were right to worry about state aid as creating an unlevel playing field. But one of the hidden ways is not aid to particular companies, but aid to the corporate sector as a whole by low corporate income tax or low income taxes. And robbing, so when Ireland and Luxembourg have low taxes, trying to steal jobs from other countries, they're actually robbing other countries. It's not a neighborly way to behave. It was, we would call that an externality, which the construction of Europe should have paid attention to. But at that point, they weren't focusing on that issue. They weren't focusing on inequality, the limits that put on inequality. There was a lot of literature that that said you should worry about this when you create a fiscal federation. But the moment of neoliberalism, they focused on other issues. Another externality they didn't focus on was, in the absence of a banking union, in particular common deposit insurance, a single market could lead to divergence. Because if a country has a problem, money could leave the country, weakening the banking system, weakening the economy. So money goes from weak countries to strong countries. Now, neoliberalism said that's not the way money flows. It flows from rich countries to poor countries. Well, that's maybe what it's supposed to do, but anybody who's looked at the history of capitalism knows that's not the way money flows. Money has been flowing into the United States, $500, $600 billion a year. We are becoming a weak country under Trump, but that's another story. But the general flow of money has always been, banks don't lend to people who need it. They lend to people who have a lot of money, as we've seen Deutsche Bank lending to Trump. So the basic principles here are that the rules of the game were supposed to mitigate externalities, They didn't focus on the right externalities, and the result of this is that they led to divergence rather than convergence. So what we've seen in the recent years is that the countries, rather than getting closer together, the rich have been growing and the poor have been declining, and the disparity between the richest and the poorest within Europe have been growing. So that has made it even more difficult for Europe to work as a whole. So the general principle was that these set of rules would lead to shared prosperity, and that shared prosperity would lead to a stronger sense of solidarity, and that solidarity would lead to strengthening the European project. The worry is that the wrong rules have led to divergence. Differences between creditors and debtors have gotten larger. Disparities between the richest and the poor have gotten larger. The failures, in large part, have undermined European solidarity. And this inevitably is going to have political consequences that are being felt. As I said, the book begins by beginning with the macroeconomics, because that is where the center of the debate in Europe has been about austerity and about how to address it. One of the challenges that we had in writing the book was that we couldn't limit ourselves in the way the American book did to, you might call, blue sky analysis. We couldn't ask what were the rules that one would like to have, because we were very much aware that changing the rules in Europe is very difficult. You have to get agreement among very disparate countries. So while we talk about what should have been done, we also talk about how within existing rules you can reinterpret those rules in ways that can lead to greater employment growth and stability. So we talk about a redefinition of the rules, and Europe has been doing that, and we talk about the successes in doing that, but it hasn't gone far enough. So the fact that they've been doing it shows that there is a real possibility of reinterpreting the rules, but the question is, has it gone far enough in doing that? And we suggest that it's not. Well, to say, the book begins on focusing on the macroeconomics, including fiscal policy, monetary policy, the rules that should be governing the ECB. There's nothing in the rules that say 2%. But we also talk about changes in the governance. There should be a greater voice for employment and labor in setting interest rates, not just the financial markets. The important role of investment, that if Europe is going to have continued growth, that there has to be more investment, and including investment in R&D. And that's one area that there's been a lack within Europe. But after the first part, where we talk about the macro, we go on to the micro. Now, as I said, this has to do with a whole gamut of rules. There are some areas where Europe has really been leading the way. And today's newspaper was another example, provide another example. Vestager's bringing successfully the case against Google for its anti-competitive practices in advertising are, the third case with very large fines, and from what I could gather, totally deserved. And there's been a hesitancy of American antitrust authorities to take on the big tech companies. And to allow mergers to occur, which should not have occurred. That just highlights the importance. If we believe in a market economy, the basis of a market economy is competition, and we are running the risk of economies dominated by oligopolies. In the United States, this is where we are today. And there is a growing consensus that this growth of oligopolies is associated with the weaknesses of investment and the growth of inequality. And almost surely the next progressive administration will put the issue of antitrust competition very high on the agenda. Worth noticing that European policies show up in the data. Europe has become more competitive. Markups are smaller. Concentration is less. So policies do make a difference. And one of the reasons why there's less inequality in Europe than in America has to do with greater enforcement of competition. But there are many other dimensions that we talk about: intellectual property, corporate governance. I already made a reference to that. Financial sector regulation. We have a chapter 5 is on financial sector regulation. I think there is a broad consensus on both sides of the Atlantic that we haven't done enough on financial sector regulation. In the United States, Dodd-Frank was not enough, but the ink was hardly dry when the financial sector started pushing back, and we had repeals of key provisions of Dodd-Frank, and now the Trump administration is a concerted effort to once again deregulate. I was at a dinner where, right at the very beginning of Trump administration, where one of the leading leading advisors was championing the deregulation that he was going to get, showed enormous ignorance of the regulatory process. But that was more amusement. Like somebody at the dinner said, asked quizzically, didn't we have a crisis in 2008? And the guy seemed to have forgotten, even though he was a major player in that crisis. So it's one of the things, it's a decade ago, but we shouldn't forget there was a crisis, and it was a financial crisis, and it was caused by deregulation. And what we've learned in the years since then, the bad behavior of the banks was even worse. We didn't know fully about the misdeeds of Wells Fargo, of the banks and manipulating the derivative markets and the foreign exchange markets. There's a whole list of things that we were not fully aware of and that we had not fully addressed. The the two parts of the book deal with the European social model, the European welfare state, and globalization. Let me just say a word about those. There are some people who've argued, including the head of the European Central Bank in an interview with the Financial Times, that Europe's crisis was caused by an excessively strong welfare state. It was a very curious allegation because, this is always true that if you're a central banker, you're going to blame somebody else for causing a crisis, not that you didn't regulate the financial sector. And actually, Mervyn King, I heard him give a wonderful speech. He said, we like to talk about wages and labor markets, everything except what we're supposed to be talking about because it's obviously easier to criticize others than to criticize ourselves. But the fact was, the countries with the deepest welfare states did not have a crisis. And the countries with the most financial deregulation did have a crisis. The United States led the way in financial deregulation and had the biggest crisis. And the links are unambiguous. So, in fact, it was the European welfare state that the consequence of that was that the downturn in Europe was less than it otherwise would have been. It mitigated the depth of the downturn, particularly in Germany, for instance. So But the consequence of the crisis itself was this pressure to weaken the welfare state and the social protections. And the irony is that the changes in the economy, beginning over the last 40 years, should have meant that we should be strengthening the welfare state. There are a lot of underlying forces, what we call skill-biased technical change, certain aspects of globalization, trade with developing countries, the effect of which was weakening wages of unskilled workers, and actually of all workers. And so leading to more inequality, more precariousness, more vulnerability. And that was exactly the time where, if you believed in keeping your economy more open to innovation, keeping your economy more open to globalization, you should have protected the people who were being adversely hurt. If you really were trying to argue that these changes in technology and globalization were going to be beneficial to everybody, you wanted to make sure that they actually were beneficial to everybody, and to do that, you needed social protection. But exactly when we needed social protection the most, we started to eviscerate our systems of social protection. And the result of that has been that large parts of society have not done very well. And the consequence of that, in turn, has been the kinds of political movements that have turned elsewhere, falsely, with false promises, that protectionism will be the answer. But we need social protection, but without protectionism. And we haven't provided that. So we also discuss here an important issue that has not gotten, I think, sufficient attention, and that is labor law. There have been a lot of subtle changes in labor law, not only in the law, but also in the practice and how bargaining takes place. And those changes can have a very large effect on distribution, on the well-being of workers, on the distribution of income between labor and capital. And in fact, some research suggests that a very large fraction of the decrease in labor share can be explained by these changes in the rules and practices. So just at a time when we should have been strengthening social protections and the rules of bargaining to help workers, we went the other direction. And that led to greater inequality in market income. So much so that actually in some of the European countries, the inequality in market income is as bad as it is in the United States. Fortunately, Europe has more redistribution, so the people are not left as unprotected as they are in the United States. But one has to recognize at the same time that the rules have been changed in ways that market income has become as unequal as it is in the United States. Finally, let me just say a word about globalization, because just like the rules within the national economies in Europe are set by the European framework, the rules of the European framework are set in part within the context of globalization. Trade rules, investment rules, and so forth. And we take a look at the whole gamut of those rules. Perhaps the most provocative and most interesting are discussions on investment agreements. It used to be argued that you need investment agreements to protect property rights. It is really remarkable that that argument is being used in negotiations, was used in negotiations with the United States and Canada, as if the United States and Canada do not have a judiciary. Now, I have some questions, and you know, the way we can worry about the direction which is going, but it's that's not the problem. It's not that you don't have good protection of property rights in the United States, and we shouldn't worry in the United States that you don't have good protection of property rights in Europe. These investment agreements are not about the protection of property rights in that sense. They are an attempt to stymie regulations. They are provisions that are technically called regulatory takings provisions. They're not even about non-discrimination. And we describe how if you really wanted to focus on what is the real issue, alleged real issue, which is discrimination, you could write a very simple investment agreement that would be non-controversial. And the interesting thing is the most recent trade agreement that the United States has negotiated has actually eliminated the investment agreement provision, except for the oil and gas industry. So showing that, in fact, you don't need it, and that the business community will even go along if you drop these provisions. So, of course, they like a gift. But the question is, do you need to give them that gift that changes the basic rules of relations between corporations and society in a fundamental way? But the other big issue on globalization is the defining issue today in the world, which is climate change. It is the existential issue and has to be dealt with globally. I'm not going to say very much more about it, except that climate change is the defining issue of the day, and that as we write the rules of every aspect of our economy, we have to keep that in mind, and that our the obligations we put on corporations, our trade agreements, have to reflect the risks that we as a planet face if we don't address the issues of climate change. So I hope this book will spur some debate, some discussion about there is an alternative to the existing rules. We sometimes just take these rules as given, God-given, coming down, inherited, but in fact they are made by legislatures, by governments, and that's the good news. They can be changed by the political process. And if we understand the consequences of the rules, then we can start to begin a debate to say, can we change the rules in ways that will get more robust growth and more shared prosperity for Europe? Thank you.